Hello, my friends, and welcome to Night Whisper. This is a quiet place where we drift together into unanswered skies. Slowly, calmly, and without fear. Here, we don't rush toward conclusions. We listen, we observe, and we let the mystery breathe. If these stories bring you a sense of calm or keep you company through the night, you're always welcome to stay with us. Subscribing gently helps this space grow, and it allows more quiet minds to find their way here. You can also leave a soft, like if the story helps you relax, unwind, or feel less alone beneath the night sky. And if any thoughts rise as you listen, you're welcome to share them in the comments below. And just out of quiet curiosity, where are you listening from tonight? I love seeing how far these whispers travel through the dark. Chapter 1, a country that wasn't looking up. Belgium did not expect the sky to ask anything of it. In the late 1980s, the country moved through its evenings with practiced familiarity. Streets dimmed on schedule, windows glowed, then darkened. Cars traced this same routes home, night after night, their headlights stitching brief paths through mist and drizzle. The sky, when it was noticed, at all belonged to weather forecasts and airline schedules. It was background, infrastructure, a ceiling that never answered back. Nothing about Belgium suggested a coming mystery. This was a nation shaped by borders and routines, by compromise and administration. Its airspace was some of the most monitored in Europe, crisscrossed by civilian flights and watched carefully by NATO installations. The skies were regulated, mapped, and largely uneventful. If something unusual had appeared overhead, it would not have gone unnoticed, but neither would anyone have expected it to arrive in the first place. UFOs, as a concept, lived elsewhere. They belonged to deserts and distant coasts, to American highways and lonely forests. They belonged to pulp paperbacks and late-night television, not to commuter towns and agricultural fields, bordered by hedgerows. In Belgium, such stories felt imported, slightly embarrassing, and easy to dismiss with a smile. Before 1989, unidentified flying objects were not part of the national conversation. There was no widespread subculture devoted to watching the skies, no expectation that something extraordinary might interrupt an ordinary evening. If lights appeared overhead, people assumed aircraft. If shapes moved strangely, they blamed perspective or fatigue. The sky was trusted to behave, and so most people did not look up. They looked at traffic signals changing from amber to red. They watched the steam rise from cups of coffee. They listened to radios, murmur news, and music into kitchens and cars. Parents tucked children into bed. Police officers followed their patrol routes. Military personnel reviewed routine data streams that rarely surprised them. Belgium was not waiting for a sign that unpreparedness matters. It is easy to believe in the strange when you are searching for it. It is far harder when your attention is anchored to the everyday, when nothing in your experience suggests that the night might suddenly demand explanation. This is what gives the Belgian UFO wave its quiet power. It did not arrive in a place already primed for wonder or suspicion. It emerged in a country accustomed to predictability, where the sky was an afterthought and mystery felt out of place. When the first reports surfaced, they did not sound like declarations. They sounded like hesitations. People struggled to find language that would not embarrass them. Conversations began cautiously, often with disclaimers. I know how this sounds. It was probably not. I don't usually believe in these things. Those phrases mattered. They revealed resistance, not eagerness, a reluctance to attach meaning too quickly. Witnesses were not reaching for mystery. They were backing into it, step by uncertain step. And yet, something had begun to press against the edges of routine. The first nights did not feel historic. They felt awkward, unsettling in a way that resisted drama. People returned home, carrying an image they could not easily discard, replaying it in their minds while brushing their teeth or lying awake in bed. The next morning, life resumed. Work, school, errands. But the sky no longer felt entirely passive. A question had slipped into the margins of thought. Belgium, without intending to hide, began to look up, not with anticipation, not with belief, but with the uneasy awareness that the familiar ceiling above its towns and roads might not be as empty or as obedient as it had always assumed, and that awareness, once introduced, refused to stay contained. Chapter 2. Eupen, November 29th, 1989. Eupen did not announce itself as a place where history would pause. It was the kind of town that settled into night without ceremony. Streets narrowed into residential calm. Gardens darkened behind low fences. The border nearby Germany just beyond felt administrative rather than dramatic. A line on a map more than a threshold. On the evening of November 29, 1989. Nothing suggested that Eupen was about to be remembered for anything at all. The night air carried winter's edge, not biting, but insistent. The sky lay open and legible, a clear canopy punctured by stars that appeared indifferent to the lives unfolding beneath them. People finished dinners. Doors closed. Engines cooled. A weekday loosened its grip. Then, slowly, attention lifted. It didn't happen all at once. No flash, no thunderclap. Just a pause, someone lingering, a little longer outside, someone else slowing their car, another stepping closer to a window, heads tilted not in alarm, but in mild confusion, as though the sky had mispronounced something familiar. Above fields and rooftops hovered a shape that refused to resolve itself into anything known. It was large, to be mistaken for a distant aircraft, and defined by edges that met with unsettling precision. An equilateral triangle, witnesses would later say, suspended low enough to feel present, not astronomical. At each corner, a white light burned steadily, neither flickering nor flaring. At the center, a darker glow pulsed in slow intervals, deep red shading toward amber, like a heartbeat measured by something other than time. The object did not cross the sky. It held its position. People watched longer than they meant to. Minutes slipped by unnoticed. The lights cast illumination onto the ground below, bleaching patches of field and road into sudden clarity, as if a stadium had been erected overhead. Without warning, shadows stretched, sharpened, then softened again as the glow shifted. There was no sound to anchor the sight, no engine note, no rush of air. The silence pressed against the ears, making the scene feel sealed, self-contained. Cars idled where they had stopped. Conversations thinned into murmurs. Someone pointed, someone else shook their head, not in disbelief, but in an effort to reset their vision. Nothing about the object suggested haste. It drifted when it moved at all, adjusting position with the patience of something unconcerned by being observed. And that, more than its size or shape, unsettled those watching. The craft behaved as though it belonged there. Later, witnesses who'd struggled to explain why they had not reached immediately. For their cameras, why they had not shouted or run. The truth was simpler and harder to articulate. The moment resisted reaction. It felt less like an event and more like a condition, something to be endured, rather than confronted. Eventually, the object did what it had not done before. Without warning, without a visible transition, it accelerated. There was no arc, no gradual departure. One instant, it occupied the sky above Eupen. The next, it had slipped beyond perception, leaving only darkness where light had been. The absence felt louder than the presence had been. People stood in place, waiting for something else to happen, unsure whether the scene had truly ended. It had. In the hours that followed, reports accumulated quietly. Neighbors spoke to neighbors. Drivers called police stations, uncertain how to phrase what they had seen. Descriptions aligned in ways that surprised even those offering them. The same geometry, the same lights, the same lack of sound. By morning, Eupen felt ultinaut, visibly, not structurally, but perceptibly. The town looked the same, yet conversations carried a new undertone. Questions surfaced carefully, framed to avoid ridicule. You were outside last night, or not you? Did you notice anything strange? And when answers matched, something shifted. This was not a single sighting filtered through rumor. It was a shared experience, stitched together by repetition. People who had never met found themselves describing the same object with the same reluctant precision. The sky, it seemed, had offered a shape that could not be easily bent into misunderstanding. Eupen had not gone searching for the unknown. It had been found by it, and from this small border town, this unassuming collection of streets and fields, the wave began to move outward, carrying with it a question that would not remain local for long. If something like this could appear here without warning, where else might it choose to linger? Chapter 3. When police became witnesses, authority entered the story without ceremony. On the night of November 29, 1989, while Eupen's residents were still trying to decide whether what they had seen deserved a second thought, 2 police officers were already moving through the town's outskirts on routine patrol. Heinrich Nicoll and Hubert von Montigny were not scanning the sky. Their attention rested where it always did, on roads, buildings, the quiet choreography of a night that rarely surprised them. Nothing in their training prepared them for what waited above the fields. The object hung low enough to command the landscape, not distant, not ambiguous. It occupied space with a solidity that made comparison inevitable and useless. An equilateral triangle, vast and precise, its edges implied rather than outlined, as if darkness itself had been folded into geometry. At each corner, a white light burned with unwavering intensity. At the center, a deeper glow throbbed in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The officers stopped their vehicle. What followed was not confusion, but assessment. Distance, size, movement. Habit took over where disbelief might have intruded. They watched as the lights spilled downward, washing the ground beneath the craft in stark illumination. Fields brightened. Shadows appeared where none should have existed at that hour, stretching away from fence posts and trees, as though dawn had been briefly misplaced. The craft did not rush. It hovered, steady and controlled, then shifted position with care, sliding through the air rather than cutting it. There was no sound to match the scale of what they were seeing. No mechanical roar, no echo, just a low presence that pressed against perception without announcing itself. At one point, a faint hum emerged, not loud enough to describe as noise, not steady enough to classify as machinery. It existed on the edge of hearing, felt more in the body than the ear. Then it faded, leaving the silence intact. The officers followed as the object drifted toward a nearby retirement home. The absurdity of that detail would linger later. Something so unfamiliar moving above a place associated with routine, age, and rest. The contrast sharpened the experience, grounding it in the unmistakably real. And then, without transition, the craft left. There was no climb, no acceleration curve, no visible preparation. One moment, the triangle occupied the air above them. The next, it was simply gone, withdrawn with such suddenness that the eye struggled to accept the absence. The sky closed over itself, seamless and empty. Nicoll and Von Montigny did not debate what they had seen. They did not embellish or speculate. They returned to protocol. An official report was filed immediately. This detail matters more than it appears to. The report contained no dramatic language, no conclusions, just measurements, descriptions, timing. It read like any other police document except for the thing it described. There was no attempt to soften the account into something more familiar, no apology for its strangeness. It was simply duty. Soon after, another officer in Eupen dieter, Plumans added a detail that would echo through future testimonies. While observing a similar triangular craft, he noticed a smaller luminous sphere detach from the main body. It moved independently, repositioning itself with ease before vanishing or rejoining the larger object. The motion appeared deliberate, controlled, and repeatable. That detail unsettled investigators more than the triangle itself, because once objects begin to separate and maneuver independently, coincidence becomes harder to invoke. Balloons do not behave that way. Aircraft do not divide themselves mid-air. And imagination does not synchronize across witnesses who have not compared notes. These police sightings changed the trajectory of the wave. Until then, civilians had hesitated. Now, authority had spoken not loudly, not theatrically, but clearly. The effect was immediate. Reports increased. People who had remained silent found language for what they had seen. If trained officers could describe the same object without ridicule, perhaps the experience did not belong solely to doubt. Something else shifted as well. The mystery no longer belonged only to the sky. It entered paperwork, filing systems, and official channels designed for order. The unknown had been logged, time-stamped, and signed. And once that happens, it stops being easy to ignore. Belgium had not yet grasped the scale of what was unfolding, but a threshold had been crossed. The wave was no longer carried only by witnesses looking up. It was now borne by institutions, accustomed to looking outward, enforcing boundaries, and maintaining control. The question was no longer, did something appear? It was becoming something far more unsettling. What happens when those trained to explain the world admit that, for once, they cannot? Chapter 4. Objects that behaved intentionally. As reports accumulated, the mystery did not expand outward. It sharpened. Descriptions began to align with an unsettling precision, not only in shape or light, but in behavior. Witnesses across different towns, standing under different skies, reached for the same words and then hesitated, aware of how those words might sound. The objects did not drift. They did not wander. They moved as though guided by decision. This distinction mattered. People are accustomed to misinterpreting lights in the sky. Distance bends perception. Motion exaggerates speed, but intention is harder to invent. Again and again, witnesses described movements that suggested awareness not of individuals, perhaps, but of space itself. The craft hovered, repositioned, adjusted altitude with care. It paused where it might have passed, lingered where it could have vanished. In some cases, the objects appeared to pace cars moving along highways, maintaining distance with uncanny accuracy. Drivers watched speedometers climb or fall, only to see the lights above match the change without effort. The experience forced attention inward, producing an unease that came not from fear, but from recognition. Something was responding. Detached lights became a recurring feature, small luminous spheres separating from the larger triangular forms, sliding away, holding position, then slipping back into formation, or disappearing altogether. These movements carried none of the instability associated with flares or debris. They suggested coordination parts acting in relation to a whole. For investigators, this raised an uncomfortable question. At what point does a repeated structure outweigh coincidence? Reports came from witnesses who had no contact with one another, separated by geography and circumstance, yet describing the same sequences. A craft appears. It hovers. A secondary light emerges. Motion follows intention rather than momentum. The pattern repeated often enough to resist dismissal. What unsettled people? Most was not speed or size. It was restraint. The objects rarely performed dramatic maneuvers in full view. Instead, they exhibited a kind of measured presence. When they accelerated, it was abrupt and absolute, as though speed itself were optional. When they hovered, it felt deliberate, an act of waiting rather than drifting. This behavior inverted expectations. Human technology announces itself. Engines strain. Sound trails, movement. These craft offered no such cues. They did not broadcast effort. They simply changed state. Witnesses struggled to explain why these encounters lingered long after the lights vanished. The memory returned uninvited, resurfacing in ordinary moments. A pause at a traffic signal, a glance upward during a walk. The recollection carried with it a subtle recalibration of reality, as though the sky had revealed a capacity previously hidden. Skeptics argued that such impressions could be shaped by stress or suggestion, yet the timing resisted that explanation. Many witnesses reported these behaviors. Before media coverage framed the narrative, their language was tentative, their accounts cautious. They did not embellish. They circled the details, reluctant to overstep what they had observed. And still, the same behaviors emerged. This is where the Belgian wave began to trouble even those inclined toward rational explanation. Shapes can be misidentified. Lights can deceive, but behavior consistent, repeated, and structured demands a deeper accounting. The objects did not behave like accidents. They behaved like systems. That realization marked a quiet turning point. The question was no longer limited to what was being seen. It began to shift toward how it was acting and why. If something in the sky could pause, adjust, and respond with such composure, then it was not merely passing through, it was operating. And the longer Belgium watched, the clearer it became that whatever had entered its airspace was not improvising. It was following rules that remained just out of reach, waiting to be inferred from the patterns left behind. Chapter 5. The wave finds its shape. By December, the reports no longer felt isolated. They began to arrive with a rhythm, spaced just close enough together to suggest continuity rather than coincidence. Town names changed. Witnesses differed. Yet, the descriptions remained anchored to the same essential form, as though the sky had settled on a single vocabulary and refused to deviate from it. Across Wallonia, people spoke of triangles, not vague impressions or fleeting silhouettes, but defined geometry edges meeting cleanly, lights placed with intention. The craft appeared low enough to register scale, high enough to evade touch. Witnesses gestured upward as they spoke, tracing angles in the air, their hands repeating motions made days or weeks earlier under the open night. This repetition mattered. If the wave had scattered itself across Belgium at random, skepticism would have found firmer ground. Instead, it gathered. Provinces like Liege and Namur appeared again and again in reports. Brabant-Wallon followed the pattern, did not feel like chaos. It felt like selection. People began to discover one another. Conversations unfolded cautiously. Often after initial reluctance, someone would mention an odd light. Another would pause, then describe something similar. Recognition passed between them, not excitement, but relief. The burden of solitary experience eased when shared. Whatever had been seen did not belong to one person alone. Descriptions aligned with unsettling consistency. The same white lights at the corners. The same central glow, deeper in color, pulsing with measured regularity. The same silence, the same slow hovering, followed by sudden departure that left no trace of effort behind. Yet despite the similarities, the encounters never felt rehearsed. Each carried its own context, a different street, a different field, a different stretch of highway. The craft adapted itself to place without altering its nature, as though moving through environments rather than performing for them. The wave also resisted escalation. This was not a cascade of increasingly dramatic sightings. There were no crashes, no confrontations. Instead, the phenomenon persisted at a steady register, appearing often enough to remain present in conversation, yet sparingly enough to avoid saturation. It lingered at the edge of awareness, refusing to become routine. Media attention began to stir, but it had not yet seized control of the narrative. Most reports traveled through quieter channels, police stations, local discussions, civilian research groups. The absence of sensational framing preserved the texture of the accounts. People spoke carefully. They qualified their statements. They avoided conclusions. And still, the shape remained. Investigators at SOBEPS watched the data accumulate, noting the convergence of detail. The organization did not rush to explanation. Its members cataloged first, questioned later. They understood that patterns, once forced, lose their value. What mattered was allowing the structure to emerge on its own terms. By the end of the year, it had. The Belgian UFO wave no longer resembled a collection of anecdotes. It had a quiet coherence. Not a solution, but a form. One that could be mapped, compared, and studied. The sky had repeated itself often enough to be taken seriously. For witnesses, this brought a subtle shift. The experience no longer felt entirely private. It had context now, a place within a larger what they saw, but how it fit into what others were reporting. The wave had found its shape, and with that, recognition came a deeper unease, because patterns imply process. Repetition suggests intention, and once those ideas take hold, the mystery ceases to be an isolated curiosity. It becomes something that asks to be understood. Belgium was still far from answers, that the country had crossed another threshold. It now faced a phenomenon that could not be dismissed as scattered air. Whatever had entered its nights was returning again and again, leaving behind a form that refused to dissolve. Chapter 6. A military officer on an empty road. Some encounters arrive without witnesses. Others choose them carefully. Late in December 1989, Colonel Amond was driving through the countryside near Ernech, following a route he knew by heart. The road unspooled ahead of him in gentle curves, bordered by fields that lay dormant under winter's watch. The hour was unremarkable. The drive, routine. Nothing about the evening invited vigilance. Then the light appeared. It did not descend. It did not streak across the sky. It entered his awareness gradually, settling alongside his vehicle with a steadiness that resisted panic. As Amond continued forward, the presence above the road adjusted with him, maintaining distance, as though calibrated rather than guessed. When he looked up, the form resolved into something disturbingly familiar. A triangular craft, large enough to occupy the space between field and sky without strain. Its lights echoed the pattern reported elsewhere. Bright points at the corners, a deeper central glow that shifted subtly in color. The object neither overtook his car nor lagged behind. It paced him. For a trained military officer, accustomed to identify an aircraft by sound, silhouette, and movement, the encounter produced not fear, but friction. Each known category failed quietly. No rotor wash disturbed the air. No engine note followed speed changes. The craft responded to his motion, without advertising how. Amond slowed. The object matched him. He accelerated. It remained alongside. There was no sense of pursuit, no impression of threat. The craft did not loom or press closer. It simply accompanied him, as though the road itself had gained a parallel occupant. The silence deepened the strangeness, creating an awareness that felt less like being observed, more like being acknowledged. Then, as the road approached a wooded area, the lights shifted. The central glow altered first, its hue sliding toward a different register before the entire craft angled gently away. It moved toward the trees with composure, slipping into the darkness without disturbance. No blast of air followed. No sound marked its departure. The night closed behind it, leaving the road unchanged. Amond continued driving, the absence beside him feeling sharper than the presence had been. His report, when filed, contained no speculation. It mirrored the restraint found in earlier police accounts. The description focused on movement, distance, duration. It did not reach for explanation. It did not dramatize. It simply recorded. That restraint gave the testimony weight. This was not a civilian grappling with unfamiliar skies. This was a senior officer, trained within NATO frameworks, accustomed to separating anomaly from error. His account aligned with others, not in tone, but in structure. The same geometry, the same lighting, the same controlled behavior. Investigators took notice. What distinguished Amond's encounter was not proximity alone, but interaction. The craft responded to speed changes with ease, as though aware of its relative position. This detail reinforced earlier impressions of intention. The object was not indifferent to its surroundings. It was adjusting to them. For skeptics, the road encounter introduced new discomfort. Driving conditions provide reference points. Speed, distance, alignment. Misperception becomes harder to argue. When the object in question matches motion over time, for witnesses, the account offered something else: validation. If someone trained to interpret the sky experienced the same structured anomaly, then perhaps the phenomenon did not belong to imagination or error. Perhaps it existed independently, operating according to principles not yet identified. The wave had already reached police officers and civilians. Now it had accompanied a military officer down a familiar road, matching his speed and silence, before choosing its moment to disappear. Belgium's airspace was no longer merely observed. It was being shared. And with each encounter, the line between observer and participant grew thinner, pulling those beneath the sky into a story they had not volunteered to tell. Chapter 7. The sky enters the radar. Long before headlines began to speculate, instruments were already paying attention. Radar does not wonder. It does not hesitate. It reduces the world to returns and absences, translating motion into signal. In Belgium, those signals had long followed predictable patterns: commercial aircraft, military traffic, weather systems, passing through familiar corridors. Deviations were rare, and when they appeared, they usually announced themselves as error. In late 1989 and early 1990, something else began to register. At radar stations in Glons and Semmerzake, operators noticed tracks that refused to settle into known categories. Objects appeared where none were scheduled to be. They vanished without transitioning out of range. Speeds shifted abruptly, not gradually, as though momentum were optional rather than required. These were not single anomalies. They repeated. At first, the data prompted caution rather than alarm. Radar artifacts are well understood atmospheric effects, reflections, interference. Operators cross-checked systems, recalibrated instruments, searched for mundane explanations. The sky, after all, has many ways of misleading technology. Yet the returns persisted. What troubled analysts was not just presence, but behavior. Tracks would hold position, then surge. Altitudes changed sharply, sometimes within seconds, collapsing thousands of feet as though distance had been compressed. Conventional aircraft could not reproduce such profiles without consequence. At the same time, reports from the ground continued to arrive. Police stations logged calls, describing triangular craft hovering in areas, now echoed by radar anomalies. Civilians pointed skyward, at moments that coincided with unexplained returns. The overlap did not occur every time, but often enough to raise a quiet concern. Independent systems were noticing the same disturbances. The sky had begun to answer back. For military officials, this convergence altered the situation. Visual sightings alone invite debate. Radar data alone can be disputed. Together, they create a tension that demands response. Observation was no longer sufficient. The question had shifted from, "What is this?" to, "What is it doing in controlled airspace?" Behind closed doors, discussions grew more focused. Procedures were reviewed. Interception protocols, rarely used outside exercises, entered conversation. The possibility that these objects represented foreign technology could not be dismissed without verification. By March 1990, the accumulation of data had reached a threshold. When radar stations once again detected targets behaving outside known parameters, the decision was made. Fighter aircraft would be launched, not to engage, not to provoke, but to observe at close range, guided by the same instruments that had first raised the alarm. The sky, once passive and assumed, had become a participant in its own scrutiny. What made this moment remarkable was not the decision itself, but the restraints surrounding it. There was no public announcement, no attempt to dramatize the action. The response unfolded quietly, as institutional reflex rather than spectacle. Radar screens glowed in darkened rooms. Operators tracked returns that refused to stabilize. Somewhere on the ground, pilots prepared to enter a night sky that had already demonstrated its unwillingness to conform. This was no longer a matter of individual experience. The wave had crossed into systems built to enforce certainty, and those systems were beginning to register something. They could not command, could not categorize, and could not predict, only follow, as best they could, through the shifting geometry of an unfamiliar sky. Chapter 8. The night Belgium looked up together, March 30th, 1990, did not announce itself as a turning point. The evening unfolded like countless others. Traffic thinned. Houses settled into darkness. Across, Belgium. The familiar choreography of night resumed, steady, unremarkable, dependable. No sirens cut the air. No warnings flickered across screens. And yet, beneath that surface calm, something had already begun to gather. The first calls came in from the outskirts of Brussels and the towns of Brabant-Wallon. Drivers slowed on highways, unsettled by lights holding position above their lanes. Residents stepped into gardens, drawn by an unease they could not immediately name. Police stations received reports within minutes of one another, voices measured but uncertain, describing shapes that refused to behave like aircraft. Triangles again, large, deliberate forms hovering above suburbs, their corner lights fixed and brilliant, their central glow pulsing with unhurried regularity. The objects drifted over rooftops and fields alike, moving without urgency, as though mapping the terrain below. What distinguished this night from those before was not novelty, but scale. Reports multiplied across regions, arriving from different towns with unsettling simultaneity. Witnesses did not describe chaos. They described composure, craft adjusting altitude, sliding laterally, pausing above familiar landmarks, highways, residential streets, open farmland. No environment appeared excluded. Police radios carried overlapping accounts. Officers dispatched to investigate found themselves looking up alongside civilians. There was no single vantage point, no privileged angle. The phenomenon unfolded above shared space, visible to anyone willing or compelled to notice. By midnight, radar stations had begun registering anomalies. Unidentified tracks appeared and disappeared across controlled airspace, matching the locations and timing of ground reports. With increasing frequency, speeds fluctuated. Altitudes collapsed and reappeared. The data refused to resolve into error. This convergence triggered a response that had been quietly prepared. Fighter jets launched into the darkness. From Bovacane airbase, F-16s climbed toward targets that had already demonstrated their indifference to expectation. Guided by radar, pilots adjusted course, entering airspace where the distinction between instrument and intuition had begun to blur. Below, the wave crested. An estimated 143 initial reports would be logged that night. Many arriving before media coverage had time to shape interpretation. Later, as news spread, the number grew, but the foundation had already been laid by uncoordinated observation and independent detection. Skeptics would later argue that publicity amplified perception, that once attention turned skyward, ambiguity multiplied. The argument holds weight up to a point, but it struggles to account for the timing. Radar anomalies preceded the surge of calls. Military response followed data, not headlines. The sky that night did not belong to any one witness. It belonged to Belgium, from suburban streets to open fields, from police vehicles to cockpit instruments. The same geometry repeated itself, the same controlled movement, the same refusal to announce origin or intent. And then, just as quietly as it had intensified, the wave began to loosen its grip. Toward the early hours of March 31, the objects withdrew. Radar returns faded. Calls slowed. Jets returned to base without answers, carrying recordings that would later be studied and debated. The night resumed its familiar shape, leaving behind a residue of disbelief that refused to dissipate with dawn. Belgium woke to a morning that looked unchanged, but something had shifted. For the first time, the phenomenon could not be framed as scattered experience or private uncertainty. It had unfolded in public, across regions, observed by civilians and institutions alike. The country had looked up together, and having done so, it could no longer pretend that the sky was merely a backdrop. Chapter 9. The F-16 interceptions. The jets rose into darkness, carrying both technology and expectation. Pilots were trained to track, identify, and intercept, yet nothing in their manuals prepared them for what awaited. Radar guided them toward targets that defied classification. Blips appeared and vanished. Speeds jumped from hundreds to over 1,000 miles per hour in seconds. Altitudes collapsed, only to rise again, almost instantly. For human physiology, such maneuvers would be fatal. Yet the objects persisted, precise and controlled. Pilots reported frustration. The targets seemed aware, anticipating movements, appearing just out of reach, reappearing with casual defiance. Ebe Mielbergs, one of the F-16 pilots, later recalled moments when a radar lock was established, only to vanish moments later. The craft reappeared elsewhere, almost taunting, yet never reckless. It was interaction without communication, a game played at speeds beyond human endurance. Ground crews and radar operators witnessed the same anomalies from their fixed positions. Glons and Semmerzake recorded patterns that mirrored visual reports. Hovering, abrupt acceleration, splitting formations. It was one of the rare occasions where independent observation, civilian, military, instrumental, aligned almost perfectly. The interceptions offered no resolution. Jets could not close the distance. Engagement protocols were attempted and abandoned. Objects did not flee in panic, nor confront with aggression. They behaved as if following rules unknown to human observers, existing within a logic that respected neither gravity nor expectation. By the end of the night, the Belgian Air Force faced a paradox. Trained professionals, operating some of the fastest aircraft in Europe, had witnessed a phenomenon that challenged every assumption about flight and maneuverability. Radar returns, eyewitness accounts, and instrument data confirmed it. Something extraordinary had moved deliberately through Belgian airspace. Publicly, the Air Force remained cautious. Officials released statements acknowledging unidentified objects and detailing interception attempts. Internally, analysts compiled extensive logs, measuring speed, trajectory, and behavior. Both approaches underscored an unprecedented willingness to document uncertainty without resorting to dismissal. The significance extended beyond national boundaries. NATO affiliated personnel and allied observers took note. Belgium had experienced a wave that was, in both scale and documentation, unmatched in modern history. The event demanded scrutiny, discussion, and humility. For witnesses on the ground, the F-16 sorties confirmed something already suspected. The phenomena were not hallucination. They were tangible, responsive, and consistently documented across independent observers. The sky had been shared not only by the public, but by professionals trained to interpret and respond. Yet they too encountered limits to understanding. That night, the boundary between ordinary life and unexplained reality blurred. Roads, fields, and suburbs resumed their familiar forms by morning, but the traces of extraordinary movement persisted. In radar logs, in pilot recollections, in the growing awareness that the world above was not wholly known. Belgium had entered a new chapter in aerial phenomena, one where both civilians and the military bore witness to something deliberate, intelligent, and utterly unexplainable. Chapter 10. The silence that followed. After the jets landed and the radar screens dimmed, something unexpected settled over Belgium. Quiet, not the ordinary quiet of a night ending, but a heavier stillness one, shaped by unanswered questions. March 30th had delivered spectacle without resolution, evidence without explanation. And now, as daylight returned, institutions and individuals alike were faced with the same problem. What do you say when certainty refuses to appear? The Belgian Air Force chose restraint. Instead of denial, there was acknowledgement. Officials confirmed that unidentified objects had been tracked, that interception attempts had occurred, and that the behavior observed could not be attributed to known aircraft. It was a careful balance, transparent without speculation, factual without conclusion. This alone was unusual. In many countries, similar events had been buried beneath ridicule or bureaucratic language. In Belgium, the response leaned toward honesty. The unknown was allowed to remain unknown. Behind closed doors, analysis intensified. Radar tapes were reviewed frame by frame. Speed calculations were rechecked. Timelines were compared against civilian reports, police logs, and pilot testimonies. Again and again, the same patterns surfaced. Sudden acceleration, controlled hovering, intelligent response to pursuit. No foreign power claimed responsibility. No experimental program fit the performance envelope. No natural phenomenon accounted for structured movement and interaction. Each conventional explanation collapsed under its own limitations, leaving behind a widening gap. Public reaction unfolded in layers. Some laughed it off, retreating to familiar skepticism. Others felt unease, not because of fear, but because of implication. If the objects were real and evidence suggested they were, then they represented something operating freely within controlled airspace, beyond human reach. Newspapers debated tone. Television panels argued probability. The word UFO returned to public vocabulary, no longer whispered, no longer theatrical, but spoken with cautious seriousness. For the witnesses, the silence was personal. Police officers who had filed reports returned to routine patrols. Civilians who had stood in gardens and streets resumed daily life. Yet something lingered, a sense of having briefly touched a boundary, and stepped back, unchanged on the surface. Altered underneath, the sky offered no follow-up. No dramatic return, no escalation, just absence. This absence proved as powerful as the events themselves. It prevented closure. Without repetition, the mind could not normalize the experience. Without explanation, memory hardened rather than faded. Investigators would later note this pattern. The phenomenon did not linger where it was pursued. It appeared, demonstrated capability, and withdrew, leaving behind documentation rather than destruction, questions rather than conflict. Belgium had not been invaded. It had been visited, observed, or perhaps simply passed through. And the most unsettling part was not what had happened on March 30th, but what had not happened afterward. No demand, no message, no visible intent. Only the quiet knowledge that the sky once assumed to be understood had revealed a layer that remained untouched by human authority. The silence did not end the story. It depended. Chapter 11. Investigations and documentation. In the weeks and months following the peak of the wave, attention shifted from observation to analysis. What had once been spontaneous reports became a meticulous compilation of accounts, evidence, and corroboration. Belgium's approach to the phenomena was unusual. It demanded precision without presuming explanation. SOBEP, the Belgian Society for the Study of Space Phenomena, took the lead among civilian researchers. Led by physicist Auguste Meessen, the organization collected thousands of reports, scrutinizing detail, timing, and geography. Each sighting was cataloged: location, duration, shape, light patterns, and witness credibility. The effort was exhaustive. There was no rush to sensationalize. The goal was clarity. Police reports provided a backbone of reliability. Officers had been trained to note exact details and follow formal reporting procedures. These accounts, like Heinrich, Nicoll, and Von Montigny's observation near Eupen, were cross-referenced against other civilian reports. When multiple independent witnesses described the same sequence of movements, the significance grew. Radar data offered another layer. Glons and Semmerzake maintained records that often confirmed visual sightings. The objects appeared as returns, sometimes stationary, sometimes accelerating beyond conventional limits. Analysts compared the timing of visual and radar data, searching for discrepancies. There were few. Military pilots contributed first-hand experience. Interception attempts produced logs, detailing approach, vectors, radar locks, speed calculations, and altitudes. Yves Milberg's accounts, combined with the objective measurements, presented an irrefutable tension. Skilled operators could not match the object's behavior, yet the data confirmed their presence. Even failed or hoax evidence was instructive. The Petericane photograph, later admitted to be fraudulent, reminded researchers that rigorous documentation and verification were essential. Every claim, credible or dubious, was an opportunity to test methods, refine procedures, and distinguish fact from fabrication. Together, these layers created a mosaic of corroboration. Witnesses, radar, pilots, and research groups operated independently, yet their observations aligned with surprising consistency. The pattern suggested something beyond chance or error. The investigators' challenge was nuance. They were careful not to declare certainty. The wave resisted closure. Its evidence was precise, yet incomplete. No craft had been captured, no debris recovered, no origin identified. Every explanation, extraterrestrial, experimental, military, psychological, or atmospheric, addressed only part of the phenomenon, and that was the point. Belgium's investigation became a case study in measured inquiry. The focus was not on sensational headlines or instant answers. It was on collecting, cross-referencing, and presenting data. The authorities embraced uncertainty as a valid position, a contrast to the reflexive dismissal common in other countries. For the public, the approach mattered. Transparency encouraged reporting, reduced stigma, and validated genuine observations. People were no longer afraid to speak. because their accounts were treated with seriousness, not derision. The result was a richer, more complete record than almost any other UFO case in history. By documenting both anomalies and context, Belgium transformed a string of unusual events into a body of evidence that demanded consideration. The UFOs were not a story told once. They were a continuing dialogue between the sky, human perception, and institutional rigor. Here the wave became less about spectacle and more about study, and in that study, the extraordinary weight of the unknown settled firmly into the everyday. Chapter 12. Theories and unanswered questions. No investigation could leave the phenomenon unexamined. Analysts, researchers, and skeptics each brought frameworks to the table, attempting to translate observation into understanding. Yet the more layers were examined, the more the wave resisted simple categorization. Some turned to technology. The object's movement, silent, hovering, abrupt acceleration, precise maneuvers appeared to exceed known human engineering. Proposals ranged from experimental NATO craft to classified prototypes like the rumored TR-3B. Proximity to military infrastructure, such as NATO bases and radar stations, seemed to support this line of inquiry. Yet even rigorous checks failed to validate such claims. Flight across populated regions at extreme speed, without detection or mishap, seemed implausible. The objects displayed behaviors beyond what any known aircraft could achieve safely. Others looked skyward, considering extraterrestrial origin. The flight patterns, intelligence-like responsiveness, and global recurrence of similar reports lent credibility to the hypothesis. Yet, no physical evidence, no material, no crash site, no trace accompanied these sightings. The theory explained movement, but not substance. It satisfied curiosity, but left the body of data incomplete. Psychological explanations offered another angle. Media coverage and social influence can shape perception, and misinterpretation of lights and shadows is common. But these accounts often conflicted with radar readings and pilot observations, which exist independent of human imagination. Sightings occurred across isolated areas and diverse observers simultaneously, defying the reach of mass suggestion alone. Environmental factors were considered too. Atmospheric phenomena, such as reflections, mirages, or Bragg scattering, could distort perception and radar. Yet structured shapes, intentional hovering, and independent object separation exceeded these explanations. The more data collected, the harder it became to reconcile the patterns with natural or mundane causes. Every theory solved part of the puzzle but failed to address the whole, and that was the Belgian wave's enduring challenge. Researchers documented each possibility, debated discrepancies, and catalogued anomalies. With precision, skeptics pointed out weaknesses. Believers highlighted consistencies. Both sides had merit. Yet the phenomena retained its integrity, refusing to collapse neatly into explanation. Witnesses, too, were affected. Many reported long-term changes in perception. The sky felt less certain. Reality seemed subtly flexible, and the ordinary routines of life no longer contained the extraordinary. The psychological imprint was quiet, but persistent. A subtle widening of awareness rather than panic. Belgium's approach offered a model: collect rigorously, analyze without bias, and preserve uncertainty where it exists. It demonstrated that the absence of explanation does not equate to absence of reality. The unknown can be studied, catalogued, and respected, even if it resists comprehension. By the end, one truth persisted. The Belgian UFO wave did not resolve neatly into categories of human knowledge. It was an invitation to look, to record, and to accept that some phenomena exist on the border between comprehension and mystery, and that boundary remains as compelling as it was in 1989. The wave leaves behind no spectacle, no crash, no confirmation, only questions, meticulous records, and a reminder that the sky is not fully known. Belgium had learned to observe without closure, to witness without certainty, and in that quiet, measured attention, the wave continues to whisper across time. Chapter 13. Legacy and Reflection. Decades have passed since the Belgian UFO wave first rippled across the night skies, yet its echoes remain, not in headlines or viral images. Most of those faded, but in the meticulous records, the testimonies, and the approach to the unknown it inspired. The story does not end with the last sighting. It extends into how we think, measure, and confront what eludes explanation. Belgium's wave created a blueprint. Here, credibility mattered. Police officers, military pilots, and civilians were treated as observers, not storytellers. Radar readings and flight logs were paired with human testimony, producing a layered account that encouraged scrutiny rather than dismissal. It demonstrated that when ordinary people and trained professionals alike confront the inexplicable, society can respond with rigor and respect rather than ridicule. The wave also reshaped perception. Witnesses reported subtle, enduring changes, an altered sense of possibility, an expanded awareness that the ordinary sky could conceal the extraordinary. It was not fear nor fascination alone, but a quiet, persistent recalibration of expectation. The world above had grown less predictable, and with it, so had the world below. Internationally, Belgium set a precedent. The case informed later encounters, from Rendlesham forests to the Nimitz incident. Governments observed how transparency, documentation, and acknowledgement of uncertainty could coexist without chaos. Skepticism was preserved, but openness allowed data to accumulate. The wave offered a lesson. Uncertainty is not weakness. It is a tool for understanding. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy is the reminder that some questions do not have immediate answers. The objects, their pilots, or whatever controlled them remain unidentified. No physical evidence has been recovered that fully explains their presence. The theories, extraterrestrial, technological, psychological, or environmental, explain facets, but not the whole. And that ambiguity is not a flaw. It is the essence of the phenomenon. Science, policy, and human curiosity intersect here. The Belgian UFO wave teaches us that investigation is more than problem solving. It is stewardship of observation, a commitment to truth tempered by humility. The phenomenon does not demand belief. It demands attention, careful recording, and reflection. As sightings continue to emerge, both within Belgium and worldwide, the wave feels less like a closed chapter and more like a prologue. It reminds us that the sky remains alive with possibility, that extraordinary events can unfold in ordinary spaces, and that the act of noticing calmly, deliberately, without presumption, matters more than ever. And so, we return to the simple act that began it all, looking up. For in the quiet stretch of sky above homes, highways, and fields, the question persists. Not loud, not urgent, but insistent. What else might be moving silently above us, waiting to be observed, acknowledged, and understood? Belgium did not provide answers. It provided something rarer, a model for seeing, for recording, and for living with wonder tempered by reason. And that, ultimately, is the enduring story of the sitting with the unexplained. The Belgian UFO wave did not offer neat resolutions or tidy conclusions. It did not deliver proof, nor did it provide a narrative that could be comfortably closed. Instead, it left something subtler, yet far more enduring. The invitation to observe, reflect, and reckon with uncertainty. We are left with witnesses who stood beneath strange lights, officers who documented the impossible, pilots who chased shadows across the sky, and instruments that recorded what could not be explained. Their experiences, combined, form a chorus of observation that resists simplification. The sky above Belgium, once ordinary, became a canvas of possibility, its quiet punctuated by the unexplained. It reminds us that mystery is not always a disruption, but a lens, one through which the familiar transforms into something richer, more complex, and endlessly compelling. In revisiting these events, we are asked to pause, to consider the limits of our knowledge, to honor the integrity of witnesses, and, above all, to acknowledge that some phenomena do not fit neatly into science, expectation, or belief. The Belgian UFO wave teaches a rare lesson, that curiosity need not be sensational, that uncertainty can coexist with reason, and that sometimes the most profound truths reside not in answers, but in the questions that endure. And as we close this journey, the sky remains vast, silent, and alive with possibility. It waits, it watches, and perhaps it invites us to do the same.